So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We started talking a little bit about Zoom and how we're in front of our computers a lot, and I know that you have choices of how you spend your day. If your email looks anything like mine, I could probably, Senator Haskell, be on my computer as well in meetings 12, 13, 14, 20 hours a day. So we so appreciate it. What this meeting is this is our Youth Mentor Program. We kicked it off a few months ago. And really what it is there's so many, as we start to talk about leaders, there are so many leaders and everyday leaders that we either don't get to highlight or that we literally don't see. The youth of today, it's amazing how we are not discriminating against age. There are youths out there doing amazing things in the world, and we want to make sure that they're highlighted, that they're engaged, their voice is our future. So it's really important to gather. We gather like this once a month for our Youth Mentor Series. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Heather Desjardins. During my day job, I'll call it my quotes day job, I'm the Chief Experience Officer of Conscious Capital Wealth Management, super cool investment company that believes that everyone's here for a reason and to invest with purpose, which is perfect alignment with conscious capitalism in their four tenets, where really we take a look at the importance of all stakeholders, including Mother Earth. So I have the pleasure and the honor of serving as vice chair to Conscious Capitalism Connecticut. And we meet twice a month, once with the youth and then once for every other Thursday for a gathering. But I'm going to stop talking. I'm very excited to have Senator Will Haskell with us and Sena Wazer as well with us. That'll be emceeing us and kind of spearheading all of the questions to kind of go back and forth. But let me do a formal quick introduction and we'll get right to it. So Senator Will Haskell, the 26th is the 20th State Senate District. He was elected in November 2018 to represent the 26th State Senate District. Born in, this is the only time I'm going to ever repeat this, Senator Haskell, but born in 1996. He is the youngest member of the General Council. And he attended the Westport Public Schools and graduated from Georgetown University. And really just amazing. I really thought this was really interesting is that he came back to his return to his hometown, really dedicated to having Connecticut thrive and really laser focused on providing businesses with the 21st century workforce that they need to make sure that Connecticut flourishes. Before I pass it over to Senator Haskell, let me do a quick introduction to Sena. Some of you might recognize her. Sena has been on and featured as one of our prior youth mentor during one of our calls. And Sena is a 16-year-old climate justice activist and the co-director of Sunrise, Connecticut. She has been fighting for the climate, for the environment since she was 5. And is a junior at the University of Connecticut studying environmental studies. She's a member of the Governor's Climate Action Plan and Environmental Justice Working Group. So Sena will lead our questions as well. But I don't want to take any more time. Senator Haskell, thank you again for joining us. I want to pass it right over to you.
Wonderful. Well, it's such an honor to be with all of you. And of course, great to be with Sena, who I first met, I think, on a panel when I was first elected. And we've crossed paths because so many of our interests align. So it's a pleasure to see you. And, when I got this invitation, I was really honored. I don't think of myself as a youth mentor. I am really just thrilled to be given the opportunity to work within state government on issues that I think are important to folks of all generation, but the reason of every generation. But the reason that I decided to run for office is that I think young people are just systematically underrepresented in government. You'll see this in town halls, you see it in state legislatures, and you see it in Congress, right? Every day, our government makes decisions about what the next 10, 20, 30 years are going to look like in our community. And very often they do so without any input from the stakeholders in that future. That's why every year we see, tax cuts for those on the very on the high end, both in terms of income and age, and yet I think what I would categorize as a negligence about the issue of student loan debt. It's why we see inaction on climate change, despite the fact that young people of all political parties, of all political persuasions, those who are political and those who don't care about politics, they recognize that the rising temperature of our climate poses an existential threat to our continued happiness, to our plans for the future. All of these issues are being overlooked, I think, because young people don't have a seat at the table. And, there's sort of a trope out there that young people aren't going to be taken seriously until they start to show up at the ballot. I think we've got to take it one step further. Young people are showing up at the ballot, actually, now in record numbers in the 2020 election. I think we're not going to be taken seriously until we show up on the ballot and then shoulder to shoulder with our colleagues in the committee room to advocate for our generation and to provide our vision. It's not to say that necessarily we need to fulfill President Kennedy's long overdue promise of passing the torch, but rather we deserve a seat at the table, and we deserve a voice in that conversation. So I've been really excited to work on a few issues that I think impact the next generation. As soon as I got to Hartford, I requested to become the chair of the Higher Education and Workforce Development Committee, because I think it's just getting too difficult for people to afford a degree. And unfortunately, it's happening at a moment where it's increasingly necessary to have some post-secondary education. We know that by 2025, 70% of jobs in Connecticut are going to require some degree beyond a high school diploma. We're nowhere near meeting that goal, and it's not hard to figure out why. In order to reach that workforce development need, we need 300,000 more graduates, but we're not going to get there because the price of tuition has been dramatically increasing. And as a result, enrollment has been declining, especially at our community colleges, which I think are the most important mechanism for educating Connecticut's future workforce. But the other major issue that impacts the next generation, and the issue that I know this group is eager to talk about, is climate change. You could argue, and many do, that Connecticut is a small state. We have just over 3 million people in this state, in a country with 300 million people. Connecticut alone won't solve climate change, and that's true. But I'm a big believer in Justice Brandeis's challenge that states be laboratories of democracy. I think that we need to be laboratories of so much more than that. We need to be laboratories of courage and standing up to the NRA. We need to be laboratories of progressive policy in terms of making college more affordable. And we need to be laboratories in terms of standing up to corporate interests and making sure that we're protecting clean air and clean water for the next generation, that we're protecting the beautiful natural resources that make Connecticut such a wonderful place to live. It's true that there's progress that we can make here in Connecticut in terms of reducing carbon emissions, but it's also true, and I think even more important, that we can set an example for 49 other states. We can show the rest of the country that what works here could work everywhere. So when my colleagues challenge me sometimes and say, well, why bother doing this in Connecticut? My answer is that, well, maybe it starts in Connecticut, but then maybe it goes to Virginia, to Florida, to California, to Texas, right? If we show that it's not apocalyptic to pass strong climate change protections, but in fact, mutually beneficial and smart, well, then I think we can inspire other people to follow suit. So just a few bills that I wanted to mention. I really want to do as little talking as possible and open it up for questions, but as a member of the Environment Committee, I think the leadership on that committee would be disappointed if I didn't mention a few really important initiatives that are up for a vote this year and are going to require a lot of grassroots support. First, the Transportation Climate Initiative. For those who aren't familiar, this is essentially a cap and invest program. It asks those who bring gasoline into the state of Connecticut and really all fuel products into the state of Connecticut to pay for the emissions that fuel will eventually produce. Now, critics of this program are going to say, well, it might increase gas prices. And on the wholesale market, that's true. Some of that perhaps may trickle down to a consumer at something like 5 cents per gallon maximum. But what this is going to enable is billions of dollars over the next 10 years of investments in green energy. And Governor Lamont specifically, who proposed this program, specifically has said that he is looking to channel those investments into communities that are hit hardest by the negative impacts of climate change. That means communities where we see higher rates of asthma, where pollution is impacting public health. It means investing in communities that might soon be underwater, or at least finding themselves facing rising tides. So I'm incredibly excited about the Transportation Climate Initiative, but now in my second term in Hartford, I can say confidently nothing happens in that building unless a whole lot of people speak up and voice their support. There's a million reasons that people find to vote against something. And the only way that anything becomes law, especially a challenging topic like this, is if people pick up the phone and they call their state senator or they call their state representative. So if I don't represent you in the legislature, you know how I'm going to vote on it. But if I don't represent you in the legislature, please do pick up the phone and give us a call. It's not like calling Mitch McConnell where you're going to reach some very polite and well-trained intern. We are state legislators. We don't have a large staff in any way. So pick up the phone and give us a call. You'll reach us on our cell phones in most cases. And we want to hear from you. We can't possibly do this job unless we hear from our constituents. Another hot topic that I know this group is interested in is the Killingly power plant. So, big picture for those who aren't familiar, fossil fuels are the largest source of global warming, and the Killingly power plant would produce 2.2 million tons of CO2 annually, or essentially 13% of Connecticut's CO2 emissions. Connecticut has a goal of being carbon-free, carbon neutral by 2040. We are not going to reach that goal if Killingly is built. It's why I stood up with a whole bunch of other senators to say that we don't think this is a good idea. The problem is, and by the way, I don't think that the governor wants to do it. I don't think that our commissioner at DEEP wants to do it, although I certainly wouldn't presume to speak for either of them. Problem is Connecticut's a part of this independent systems operator in New England that regionalizes the grid and gives the state of Connecticut very little control over sort of system-wide capacity and choices that are made in how to meet that capacity. We are working really hard, and by we, I really mean Commissioner Katie Dykes over at DEEP, who's a leader on this issue, in giving Connecticut more autonomy within the ISO framework, because we as a state have made a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2040. We ought to honor that commitment that we made to our constituents and to our environment, and most importantly, to tomorrow's constituents, to tomorrow's taxpayers, to our kids and our grandkids, by, I think, not building that Killingly power plant. The other issue that I just want to talk about, and there's a million things we could say about transportation, but we know that 40% of carbon emissions in Connecticut stem from the transportation sector, and it's why I'm kind of a broken record about investing in public transit options. It's too hard to get around this state if you don't own a car. I keep on my desk in the Senate a Metro North timetable from 1970, and I show anybody who will look at it that the train has gotten slower since then, not faster. By every metric, we're moving in the wrong direction. And it's because we don't really have any sustainable funding source to invest in public transportation or to invest in transportation as a whole. Now, how we can make a difference on this, there are small things that we can do, like charging the tractor trailers that travel through Connecticut and have wear and tear on our infrastructure to actually contribute to building newer, better, stronger, cleaner and greener infrastructure. But another very small thing that I've been pushing for this year, and I'm not sure it's going to pass unless a whole lot of people speak up on it in the next few days, is allowing electric vehicles to be sold directly to consumers in the state of Connecticut. This sounds wonky, but my district has the highest Tesla ownership in the state of Connecticut. Everybody who owns an electric vehicle in this state, and by the way, God bless them, we need more people behind the car of an electric vehicle. We have a state goal of putting 500,000 electric vehicles on the road by 2040. No, I'm sorry, by 2030. We're nowhere near meeting that goal. And it's because everybody who buys an electric vehicle in Connecticut has to actually go to New York State to actually purchase the vehicle. We don't, in the state of Connecticut, allow for direct sale, meaning you have to go through a car dealership. Tesla, you could name, I'm not an electric car expert, but Tesla is the biggest and most famous. Almost all of the electric car manufacturers don't engage in that dealership sales model. Instead, they engage in a direct manufacturer to consumer sale model. And whereas New York and all of our surrounding states just allow them to do so, we've got these strange, outdated 20th century laws in Connecticut that require cars to be sold through a dealership. Now, dealerships speak up and they hire lobbyists and they fight against this bill every year. But the reality is the consumers that I talk to are just frustrated. It doesn't make any economic sense that we're forcing people to travel to another state in order to buy their electric vehicle. And it really doesn't make any environmental sense that we are pushing people away from these greener and cleaner vehicles. We ought to be doing everything in our power to get more people behind the wheel of an electric car. So those are some really important initiatives that we're working on this year. I'm happy to talk more about virtual net metering, energy efficiency, the bottle bill in the Environment Committee, the Long Island Sound Blue Plan. There's a lot that's happening on the environment, thank God. And I'm very proud to have a seat at the table and honored to be with you all today. So I hope I didn't go on for too long, but Sena, maybe we could move on to questions.
Perfect, and your timing is absolutely beautiful. I'm going to pass it over to Sena, who's going to lead and spearhead our questions.
Yeah, thank you for all of that information, Senator Haskell. I really appreciate it. So it looks like there's one question in the chat right now about TCI, so maybe that would be a good place to start. So the question is, does TCI tax natural gas?
Oh, that's a great question. No, my understanding is TCI does not include natural gas. But let me say something about natural gas that we can and should do. In Connecticut, we allow natural gas companies to leak 3% of really dangerous, really terrible methane gas into the atmosphere without asking them to upgrade their pipeline or invest in sort of fixing those leaks, plugging those holes in their system. This 3% doesn't sound like a lot, but just look at one Sierra Club study in the city of Hartford. They found that 303 metric tons of methane gas leak every year. That's enough to power 214 American households every year. 313 metric tons. And if you're not furious about the fact that methane gas is being leaked into the atmosphere by natural gas pipelines, you should be furious about the fact that people are actually being charged for the gas that they never received. Imagine if a home heating oil truck showed up to deliver to fill up your home heating system, and half of the stuff that they were delivering had spilled out on the road. First of all, Connecticut has a requirement that they clean up every drop, which we don't have for methane gas, not because it's less dangerous, but simply because we can't see it and therefore don't think that we can regulate it. But also, you would be outraged as a consumer if they had spilled everything out on the road and then only filled up your tank part way because everything else had leaked out of the truck, right? You would say, no, I'm entitled to all of the gas that I paid for. That's not the case right now. So customers are paying for gas that they don't receive, and we're leaking dangerous methane gas into the atmosphere. And Connecticut is kind of unique in this 3% threshold. Some states say you can't leak any methane gas without quickly repairing the problem. Other states say, well, you can leak 1%. I think Massachusetts says you can leak 1% of your gas. Connecticut, 3% seems way too high for me, and I think for a lot of environmental activists as well. So that's one area that we can change in the natural gas realm.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, so a question that I wanted to ask was about, I guess, climate action more broadly. So right now, the Democrats hold, a supermajority in both the state and House, and obviously have the governor's seat as well. However, I've been working with the state legislature a little bit for the past 2 years, and the state is still struggling, it seems, to take the action necessary to really combat climate change. So, for example, I was trying to get a bill raised to put a moratorium on fossil fuel power plants, and Senator Cohen was really helpful with that, but it's still, it didn't happen. So I guess I'm just wondering, why do you think this is, and what can we do about it to change that?
Oh, it's a really challenging question. Part of it is the influence of lobbyists, and in a normal year, if you go up to Hartford, I was brand new to this whole thing. For context, I had never been to the state capitol before I decided to run for office. I wasn't planning to run right out of college. Instead, I couldn't believe that my state senator had been in office for as long as I'd been alive. And I thought that it was bad for democracy that nobody was challenging her on her record and forcing her to defend her votes. I still feel that way. I think I should be challenged every 2 years and forced to defend my votes. So I decided to hire my college roommate to run my campaign and to come back to my hometown and to start knocking on doors, not thinking that winning was probable, but thinking it was possible, thinking that, we could do better. And at the very least, voters deserve 2 options when they walk into that voting booth. And it's been a real journey and a learning experience ever since then. And one of the things that I learned is when you walk into Hartford, in every lobby, there are hundreds of people who peddle influence for a living. Now, Connecticut has strong campaign finance laws, which is great, which makes sure that, you know, we as elected officials are never thinking about our next, our political donors and casting votes and making decisions. That's crucial. But still, there's an ethos where lobbyists, because it's a part-time legislature, we leave one job in the morning, rush into the building to cast a few votes, aren't necessarily sure what bills are being considered that day. And somebody who makes 10 times as much, who's doing this full-time, is in the building with a fancy little fact sheet to tell us how to vote. Too often, that's how lobbyists wield their power. It's through information. It's not through campaign donations. And the only solution is not to stifle the input of lobbyists, but rather to engage more people, to engage the general public in the lawmaking process. And I was sort of jokingly complaining earlier about the long meetings, but the one great thing about legislating virtually this year is that people don't need to take the day off of work and find childcare and find transportation to get to Hartford in order to testify. We're seeing huge increases in public input in our public hearing process, largely because people can testify from the comfort of their own home. Earlier today, I was in a hearing and a nursing student took a break from her job to come and share her thoughts on a really important bill. So all that to say that I share your frustration that sometimes in Connecticut we are lethargic about doing big things. We're really good at doing small things that maybe can add up. I was a major proponent of banning plastic bags. I so appreciated your support on that bill. As I recall, my hometown of Westport banned plastic bags over a decade ago, and the sky didn't fall. People just, if you stand outside the supermarket, as you have to do when you're running for office, you'll see that people just bring reusable bags now. So I fought really hard to bring that ban to the state level, which is finally happening this year. And we know that millions of pounds of plastic end up in the Long Island Sound every year. So this is going to have a really big impact, and it made the headlines. But big picture, when it comes to addressing climate change, it's small. And we're really good at doing those small things. Sometimes we're a little bit lethargic and recalcitrant to take on those bigger items. And I'm grateful, Sena, that you've been beating the drum on those issues.
Okay, yeah, well, that's good to know. Good to hear your perspective on that. So it looks like there are a bunch more questions in the chat. The first one is, can you talk about DEEP's conservation and load management plan? I saw today that there'll be more emphasis on connecting the program to underserved communities, HES audits, and more incentives for heat pumps.
Wow. Great question. And Gavin, you probably know more about this than I do. I really am impressed by Deputy Commissioner Hackett, who oversees the conservation and load management programs. And the reason I brought it up in a hearing this morning, I'm not sure if that was the same meeting you were watching, is Connecticut is considering doing something pretty innovative and pretty cool, which is to say that 6 other states across the country do it. To say that when you're going to rent an apartment or buy a home, the previous owner or the landlord has to disclose 12 months worth of energy bills. And why is this important? Well, we know that a lot of people who think that they can afford a studio apartment, when they get their energy bill, are absolutely dumbfounded by how expensive it is. And they end up facing eviction because they simply can't afford to pay their bills. We hear the same thing with homeowners who don't anticipate how high the cost of energy is going to be. We also know that landlords, we've got conservation and load management programs available to landlords. There's a whole host of things that you can do from insulation. And I'm hardly an expert here, Gavin. It sounds like you are, so I should turn the floor over to you. But, there are a whole host of things that you can do to make buildings more efficient. But landlords, because they don't bear any of the cost of these energy bills, have no incentive to do so. Well, by creating some transparency where they're going to have to disclose how expensive energy bills typically are, there's now going to be some competition in the market. Who's got the most energy efficient building? If you're a potential tenant, you're going to be looking at a few different places and seeing where the energy bills are the lowest. So by imposing transparency, we basically incentivize landlords to invest in energy efficiency, and also to take advantage of the wonderful conservation and load management programs that Connecticut has available. They're funded, they provide some level of financial relief to landlords, and I think we need to use them more widely. I hope that answers your question. It's a narrow part of conservation and load management, but it happened to have come up this morning. Yeah, Gavin, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so that was really good. And I guess I was just going to throw in too that I think the way it works with the landlords too, that if you don't have 12 months worth of stuff that, or you don't want to share 12 months worth or whatever, you can also just have the home energy audit. I forget what it's called, but it's called the HES audit or whatever done, where they do the blower test and they, and at the end of it, they give you a report and say, this is how much it will cost to, run this apartment and all of that. So that's an incentive too, because if it looks really bad, then the landlord can do that and have all these energy retrofits done. And a lot of those are very low cost and incentivized to have insulation done and other things.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kevin. And I think that what struck me this morning from Deputy Commissioner Hackett's testimony is this is a social justice issue. We know that those on the lowest income scale are struggling tremendously under the weight of energy bills that are higher than they need to be. And with a little bit of investment from the landlords, we can provide some relief to those families who are struggling. So I'm excited to vote for that provision. It faces steep opposition from every landlord and from every realtor and from the homeowners association and you name it. But there's going to be a whole bunch of us who try hard to get it across the finish line.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. There's in our neighborhood, I did the audit at our house, and then I got excited about it. I printed out 300 copies and stuck them in all the mailboxes around the neighborhood. A bunch of people I see on walks would say, "Oh yeah, hey, I'm going to go do that." But one of the things, if there's a retired person or somebody on fixed income or low income or whatever that's renting a house, a lot of those energy things, the insulation and all that kind of stuff is free. So, even if you're a landlord and you're renting out a house like the one just down the street, and the woman in there is she's retired or whatever, if they do an audit in there, all they have to do is do the audit, and then the people can come in and do any insulation that's covered, that's in the audit framework that's qualified to be done, is essentially free. So the landlord can get all of this work done in their house just because they happen to have a retired person, or a low income person living there, which is really cool.
That is really cool. That's awesome. I think we found Deep's new spokesman, because I wish I had thought to go around when I go door knocking. You're always carrying flyers for the campaign, but I should also bring around the information how to engage in that audit, because I think a lot of people would absolutely be interested. They just don't know about it because we've got such a limited.
Yeah, and not to hijack the conversation or anything, but that was one of the things I wanted to just sort of throw out there, because education of students about climate change and just energy saving things and all of that, high school students, they understand what solar panels are, how they work, heat pumps, things like that. So getting that level of education out there, would be really good. But, it's almost like what I would propose would be really awesome is like a hands-on class where you go, basically you have a home energy audit done of your house. And as a student, you're there that day, you watch what gets done, you write up a report on that, and then, submit it to your parents. Or you could be doing a thing in your school building or your town, building and submit something into the Board of Education of your town or something and say, this is what we should be doing in our high school. We should be putting in ground source heat pumps. We should be doing this. And, to have it come from the students, because, if they catch fire on this stuff and they get excited about it, that's what's going to get us there. People who are in high school now, 10 years from now, will be halfway towards, needing to be meeting those goals. Those people will be out there able to push all this kind of stuff forward by that point.
I couldn't agree more. I would only add that we're so far behind. I think that a lot of people, and myself included, like to think that Connecticut is this, compassionate, science-oriented, forward-thinking state. And the reality is, in 2019, we had a bill that just said, you have to teach climate change in school. And like most school districts are doing this, right? Every one of the 7 towns that I represent, they're teaching climate change, but a small handful aren't. And that's terrifying, right? I mean, forget about teaching students how solar panels work. They're not telling them that the earth is getting hotter. And it was subject to something like an 8-hour filibuster in the House of Representatives by one side of the aisle. I won't be partisan. And the bill died.
Yeah. And I get that there's a political jam there, but when I think about it logically, it's like, okay, so if we had a whole bunch of people that just decided that the earth was flat, and the rest of us couldn't use the words up or down anymore, because that would, make them nervous or whatever. That would just be nuts. It's like, it's a fact. It's not like it's a thing that, we should get, I don't know, somehow, and I don't know how to get that through to people, but yeah. It shouldn't be that a flat earth society could hold the rest of us hostage.
No,
because
I
they
agree.
want to hold some illogical thing. That's just, it makes no sense. The rest of us would never put up with that. But for some reason, we're stuck with too many people holding difficult ideas and, for the rest of us to work with. And it's going to be a big struggle working to and gradually convincing people. Yeah.
I would agree.
It could start in schools though. That would be a great place. And we're open-minded there.
It's true, thankfully.
So there are a bunch more questions in the chat. I'm wondering if folks just want to unmute and ask them. Martin, I said you had one.
Yeah, I mean, it's not environmentally oriented, Will, but since you alluded to it with the candidate that you beat, any chance that Connecticut would impose term limits? I mean, we have our own Mitch McConnell's and Nancy Pelosi's. So any talk about that, or any thinking that we could actually achieve something so that people don't end up at the state capitol forever?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you for asking. I have no ideological opposition to term limits, but the problem I think is much broader than that in Connecticut. We've got this sort of quaint notion of a citizen-led legislature, meaning they only pay legislators, like $25,000 to $30,000 a year. They say that you're only going to be voting in Hartford for 6 months, but the reality is it's a full-time job. You're legislating for 6 months a year, but the other 6 months a year, you are constantly serving your constituents with a host of issues that come up. All that to say that the current makeup of the legislature is people who can afford to, it's wealthy people who've retired, it's people with wealthy spouses, and then there are some legislators who are just desperately trying to get by on this low salary. And then the worst case scenario is legislators who take outside jobs to help feed their families, but in those outside jobs come across real or even perceived conflicts of interest, right? There are legislators, for example, who work for Eversource. That's an interesting predicament, I think, given that the legislature has a responsibility to regulate those utility companies. All that to say that I think the term limits are a cool idea, and I would support them in Washington. In Hartford, because it's citizen-led, and because I mentioned folks are just they're in the building maybe only for an hour or two to vote on a few things, and then they have to leave to go back to their other job. I think that there's something to be gained when somebody's been there for a long time to know the ropes. And if we were to make it constantly a new cycle of people coming in, well, then I think it would give even more power to the lobbyists. That would be my short-term fear in Connecticut. So I could support term limits in Connecticut, but I would also support moving to a full-time legislature like other states have. We've got more than 12 months worth of problems. Why do we try to solve them in 6 months? I would support paying legislators, not exorbitantly, but just a normal wage that you would pay somebody for any other job that they're working on for 12 months a year, so that they can afford to feed their families and send their kids to school without having to take another job that could create a conflict of interest. I think there are a lot of reforms that are needed, and term limits could be part of that.
Thank you.
Well, do you see that as being part of maybe what could be perceived as an obstacle to some younger people getting involved more with legislation?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an obstacle for young people. It's an obstacle for women because too often childcare falls to women. It's an obstacle for people of color and low income folks because if you're working right, like attorneys and real estate agents are really well represented in the legislature, because if your other job provides flexibility in hours, well, then you can say, hey, I'm going to be in Hartford for the next 5 days, but I'll make up the hours next week. That doesn't work for an hourly worker who's working for $10 an hour. You can't say, by the way, I'm going to be unavailable next week. So we don't have a representative legislature. We don't have enough women in office. We don't have enough people of color in office. And I also think we really don't have enough young people in office. And again, nobody wants to go into public service to make money, right? There are better, easier ways of doing that, I think. But you should be able to go into public service and not have to necessarily worry about paying your next rent check. So I do think that there are a lot of barriers to young people running for office outside of just, will people vote for me? It's also, can I afford to run? Am I really able to do this? I was tremendously fortunate. My college roommate agreed to be my roommate. Even after college, we bought a bunk bed and found the cheapest apartment in the 26th district and paid $500 or so in rent. And, we made it work financially, but it's crazy that the system works like this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. All right. So there's another question in the chat from Paul Murphy. Do you want to unmute? And then there's a bunch more as well.
Hey, Paul.
Thanks, Will. My biggest concern is, it's the old thing of, hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. There's sort of two reps, obviously Democrats are the tax and spend group and the other ones are the no-nos, or however you want to put it. I'm fiercely independent. And my biggest concern about getting behind anything is basically nobody steps back and says after the fact, you talk about transparency. To me, real transparency is after the fact, coming back and saying, doing an after action report. Hey, we passed the ban on plastic bags. Here's what it actually has done for the environment. Here's how much money it has saved, and here's our next step or not. I think I'm a big proponent of the plastic bag ban, but I could also then say on the other side, on the transportation, you're saying, hey, we want to tax this investment, and I think of the Waterbury Mixmaster and the missing drainage system that never went in and cost gazillions of dollars, and the poor allocation of tax dollars there. And I say, yeah, more taxes is really what I want to pay. I want to know that my tax dollars are going to be spent efficiently, and that there's going to be something that comes back and says afterwards, hey, we did this worked well, this we can fix, and we want to fix and move on. So I think when you look at these things, people need to know that their money, their hard-earned tax dollars are well invested. And the question that seems to be always missing is we're good at passing the stuff, but nobody comes back and does the dirty work of checking back afterwards to see how well those things work. Just like you said about the 3% leakage, that's a great thing to know on the first year, right after the percentage is passed. Somebody should be able to come back and say, hey, what is other states doing, and how do we fix that and max up to that? And let's do that quickly and move forward, because it costs us nothing to do that, and we can make an improvement. And the question I'd love to hear people ask more is the question why. And what I mean by that is when people say, hey, look, there's people with student debt of $150,000 and they can't afford to pay it off and they're struggling. Why do they have $150,000 worth of student debt, and how do we make sure that doesn't happen again? And often it is because they took on something, like you talk about the rent thing and the heating bill, that they didn't understand what the return on their investment was going to be. And now somebody else is left with, because somebody's going to pay for that eventually. And if it's left to taxpayers to pay for that, then what am I getting from that other than freeing them from a poor decision that was made on their behalf? I'd rather us ask that question and say, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again, rather than having a bailout for people who got a good education? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's fair, Paul. I guess I want to address a few different points, but I'll start on the student debt issue, because Connecticut happens to have the highest student debt in the country. We do a really good job, to your point, of educating students. They are getting a great education, whether it's Yale or Wesley or Conn College or UConn or Norwalk Community College. Problem is, I'm not sure that they're making a choice that they realize they can't afford. They're seeing that they largely don't have any affordable choices, right? And they recognize that having some sort of post-secondary degree is increasingly necessary. There's that stat I mentioned earlier that 70% of jobs in Connecticut are going to require some degree beyond a high school diploma. So it doesn't for everybody need to be a 4-year bachelor's degree. Maybe it's a 2-year associate's degree, or maybe it's an advanced manufacturing certificate. But either way, the cost of these programs is way, way too high. And what was interesting to me, Paul, when I fought for and successfully brought free community college to Connecticut this year, is that the people who were banging on my door fighting against it the most are the private colleges, because it introduces competition into their market. I work with them on a million issues, right? They're my good friends at Yale and at Wesleyan and at Conn College. We're working to address mental health on college campuses and address sexual misconduct. But all of a sudden, they were not my friend when it came to bringing free community college, because why would a student pay $40,000 a year when they could go to community college for free? So introducing competition to the marketplace, I think, is the best way to bring down the underlying cost of earning a degree, so that we don't find ourselves facing a need to provide bailouts in years to come. The other thing is that I think that we can find opportunities to be mutually beneficial. So I know this group is all about working hand in hand with the business community on doing good. I was really proud to work on a tax credit, creating a tax credit in Connecticut. The bill number was SB 72. I can't remember what public act number it became. But what it basically said is student debt is $1 trillion problem. We're broke in Connecticut for all intents and purposes. So we can't possibly afford to forgive student loan debt overnight, at least not in the state of Connecticut. That's not how it's going to work. How can we afford to do something meaningful? Well, we can partner with the private sector. We know that businesses are eager to retain students in Connecticut. Very often, the students who are in their degree at Yale or Wesleyan or Conn College or UConn, they take off and they start their career or their small business elsewhere. So what if we started to help businesses incorporate student loan repayment as a part of their employee benefits package? So just as you look at healthcare and other options when you're getting job offers, you started to look at some companies and were drawn to some companies ideally that provided some sort of student loan repayment. And companies can't really afford to do this out of their good of their heart. So we offered a break on their corporate taxes, an annual write-off that they could provide if they offered recent graduates who were from the state of Connecticut with a break on their student loans. And what we found out is that the biggest advocates for this program, interestingly, were the realtors. They found that student loan debt delays the purchase of a first home by an average of 7 years in the state of Connecticut. So they were eager to see fewer people graduating with debt so that more people would buy homes. And what was so exciting is that we had this great partnership between the business community and those who were concerned about student loan debt. The Republicans loved my bill because it cut taxes for businesses. The Democrats loved this bill because it helped people address the student loan crisis. So I think there are opportunities where we can work together and be mutually beneficial. And then your other point was a really good one, and it's a whole separate conversation about sort of follow through in government. But the reason I feel safe and secure about TCI having a meaningful impact is that the legislation is pretty specific about what these investments would go towards. It's detailed things like traffic signal modernization and synchronization, fewer cars idling as they travel down the post road or any other street, conversion of buses from diesel to electric. EV charging stations. A lot of the people who would drive to New York to get an electric vehicle are afraid to because there aren't enough charging stations in the state of Connecticut. Air quality monitoring, intersection roundabout conversions. This is just, again, fewer cars, making sure cars are spending less time idling in traffic and more time getting where they need to be. There's also an element of TCI that I think is pretty smart from the point of view of the governor, is that it doesn't just bring in money, it also is guaranteed to reduce emissions, because when you cap the amount of fuel coming into Connecticut, you can actually monitor and set a hard limit on what we're going to see in terms of carbon emissions. So we're guaranteed, for example, to see a 26% reduction from 2022 to 2032 if the legislation is passed as currently written. In other words, it's not one of those programs, of which I will concede to you there are many, where we cross our fingers and hope it works. This is one where it's directly tied to the outcome.
Sounds good. I'd love to see that be the norm as opposed to the exception, because I think that's what I certainly struggle with. With respect to the education thing, I'll give an example. My daughter started at Quinnipiac in the X-ray program, and thankfully after one semester, because I am her student loan department, She left there and went to Gateway. And for instead of $40,000 a year, it's $3,000 a year or $4,000 a year. She got a great job at Yale. Now actually has gone back to school on her own dime to become a PA. But the point I'm making is that for her perspective, there was no rationality at the start because there was no cost comparison that you could do. And we've invested tremendously in our community colleges, and they're wonderful places. I just wish that the enrollment wasn't going down, it was going up, and we were highlighting the advantages of community college over the 4-year program and forcing, good choices, because community college is looked down upon, when in actual fact, it was funny because when she went to Gateway, it was like, gee, who are the professors? Well, actually, there are guys from Yale and from Quinnipiac who are teaching there because it's their second job. They want to make some more money, so they teach over at Gateway, teaching the exact same subjects as they were teaching at Yale and Quinnipiac. So we're doing a bad job of emphasizing how wonderful those colleges are. And at the same time, we're not trying to address the why in a forceful manner, so that we're not getting $200,000 bills associated with the philosophy of butterflies.
So true. Community colleges are the hidden gem in Connecticut, and we've got 12, 13 if you count the one online, which you should, because that's the one where enrollment is actually on the increase. And not just that, but also our 4-year state universities are underutilized, and they're not as cheap as community college, but they're much cheaper than the alternatives out of state. I can't tell you how many people I went to high school with who went off to a public institution in some other state and paid an out-of-state tuition that was so much higher for an education that was as good, if perhaps a little bit worse, than what they would have seen at Western Connecticut State University, Southern Connecticut State University, these exceptional 4-year institutions. So something we're working on that's kind of cool to try to reverse that trend and increase enrollment, not just among those who would normally go out of state, but also among those who didn't think college was possible, is 13 other states have an auto admission policy. In other words, if you're in the top 40, 30, 20% of your class, we have to set what that number is in the next few weeks. But if you're in the top X% of your class, without any application, you're automatically admitted to one of the state universities. By taking down that barrier, we've seen in other states, and that's the coolest part about this job, you get to look at 49 other examples for what works and what doesn't. We've seen in other states that they do a better job of keeping more students in state and inspiring them to go to those cheaper, high quality public institutions, whether they be community colleges or our 4-year institutions. And by the way, at our community colleges and 4-year institutions, 87% of the people who graduate are still in Connecticut 5 years later. So when you talk about investing in Connecticut's future, that's the best place to focus.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, so sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. There are more questions in the chat from, I saw that Sylvina had put a couple in.
Yes, hi, how are you? Thank you. This is super interesting, and I'm learning a lot from this chat today. So I wanted to ask about the Connecticut solar panel rebates, and if there was any plan to extend that rebate and that incentive, because I think it provides a huge relief for many homes and businesses. So I just wanted to find out what are the plans with that.
I certainly hope so. To be perfectly frank, I'm a new member of the Energy and Technology Committee. So I am just learning the ropes of these tax credits that exist, but I'm entirely in support. The problem is always our state's finances. Well, the problem is twofold. Eversource and traditional energy companies have a team of lobbyists that fight against expansion of solar. And then also our state is genuinely financially limited in terms of expanding tax credits. But I think it's a fantastic idea. I support clearing the queue on virtual net metering. I'm a big believer in community shared solar to bring down energy costs for those who can't necessarily afford to put solar panels on the top of their house. I sponsored a bill with Representative Steinberg on that this year. There's a lot that we need to do. I'm not sure it's going to happen. I know it won't happen overnight because they've been pushing for years and years and years. But I think we're getting closer to recognizing that solar and renewables are the future. And I am encouraged that Governor Lamont is really drawn to offshore wind as a mechanism of fueling our grid. Fueling is the wrong word, of power in our grid here in Connecticut.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your question.
This is great. And I know that, Dwayne, we're coming up and being very mindful of the time as we're coming up. Time flies when you're having fun. But I know that, Dwayne, you had another question. I know, Sena, you have one more question. So I think we can get 2 more questions in before we have to wrap up.
Yes, Senator, I just wanted to know what can we do to help get some of these bills passed, especially Ned Lamont's bill, the big one, and even the one that has to do with the home energy and so forth. What can we do?
Thank you so much. TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative, is going through the Environment Committee. So the most helpful thing you could do, we are on a tight timeline because, like I mentioned, the legislature only meets for 6 months. We've got these crazy self-imposed deadlines. In the next few weeks, we've got to pass this bill out of committee. And I'm not the chair of that committee, so I haven't done a vote count myself, but I imagine it's going to be close because this is one that it shouldn't be controversial, but it is. So writing to the members of the Environment Committee and encouraging them to pass TCI is going to be really, really, really important. And the same is true for the governor's energy transparency bill, which that bill is before the Energy and Technology Committee. To save you some time, I'm on both committees. I'll be voting for both of those provisions, so you don't need to email me. But please do email my colleagues because they need to hear from folks that they're in support.
All right, I have one final question also on the committees. So the committees right now have a lot of power over what bills get raised and passed. So when the chairs are resistant to something, it kind of feels like that's like a big roadblock and there's nothing really to do to get that bill raised and passed. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions about how to work around that or change that in some way.
Ooh, a major structural change would be necessary. It's true that Connecticut's legislative system puts an enormous amount of power sort of to the committee chair of that committee. So I wield very little power in the Environment Committee other than being a voting member. I wield maybe more power in the Higher Education Committee, which I chair. So I don't know the solution other than the fact that every great idea that's ever passed through the legislature has a team of champions. It's not just one legislator who brings something forward. It's one legislator who calls and texts their colleagues to get them on board. And when we actually get something done, like when we brought debt-free community college, I looked around, there were like 40 legislators behind the podium, and all of them had worked on it, right? Nothing is done by one person. It needs to be a team effort. So I would say if you're facing trouble with the committee chairs, find as many co-sponsors as possible, get those names on the bill, and they'll send a signal.
Great, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, it is about that time. And as always, it's not the end of the conversation, but the beginning of the conversation. Your voice is important and we want to hear that. A special thanks to Sena and Senator Haskell. Thank you so much for joining. Your passion radiates through the screen and we can really feel it. So you're clearly doing exactly what you're meant to do right now. So thank you so much for all the good work that you're doing and Sena is doing. Thank you so much, Gavin. I see that you're unmuted.
Oh, and by the way, I just in the chat, I did put a link to Zoom recordings of topics on like transportation and all the other energy related things to do with the state's plans on that kind of stuff. So so some reference materials if you want to go there and take a look at that and watch a video instead of reading a document or something. Thanks, Will. I don't know if you wanted to say anything in the end.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It was just an honor to be with you and really appreciated the invitation. So I hope that you stay healthy.
Thank you.
Hope I'll see you in Hartford once we're doing that kind of thing again.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I
Bye,
will. Thank you.